Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Hello everyone, good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Mrs. Erlita for this opportunity so that I can do my presentation. Let me introduce myself. My name is Amalia Ramadanti Wibowo. I'm a sociology student from Erlangga University, Surabaya, Indonesia. As you can see on the screen, I'm going to present about one of the discipline or topics in sociology, which is social mobility. So let me begin with what is social mobility? According to Paul B. Harton, social mobility is a person's movement from one status to another or from one level to another. According to Kimball Young and Raymond W. Mack, social mobility is a movement in social structure, which is a pattern that organizes social groups. The movement, usually of individuals or groups, from one social position to another within the socially stratified system in any societies. This is from Giddens, the movement of individuals and groups between different socio-economic positions. Or we can say social mobility refers to the shift in an individual's social status from one status to another. The shift can either be higher, lower, intergenerational, or intragenerational. And it cannot necessarily be determined if the change is for good or for bad. Social mobility can take different forms, and people can experience different types of mobility in their different stage of life. The types of mobilities are independent of one another and can often overlap. There are two types of social mobility. They are vertical mobility and horizontal mobility. The first one is vertical mobility. Vertical mobility is when individuals or social objects move from one social status or position to another that is not on the same level. This refers to a change in the occupational, political, or religious status of a person that causes a change in their societal position. According to the direction, there are two types of vertical mobility. The first one is upward mobility and downward mobility. Upward mobility, or we can say social climbing, is when a person moves from a lower position in society to a higher one. It can also include people occupying higher positions in the same societal group. The example is when a teacher has a good record in her career, so after that, she is chosen to be the next school principal. The second one is downward mobility. Downward mobility, or social sinking, takes place when a person moves from a higher position in society to a lower one. It can occur when someone is caught performing a wrongful act that can result in the loss of the position they currently hold. The example is when a CEO in a company make a violation, like maybe he's corrupt, he can get fired, so he will be jobless. And that is a downward mobility. So The second main types of social mobility is horizontal mobility. Horizontal mobility is movement of individual or social object from one social position to another social position that have the same level. Sorokin describes horizontal mobility as a change in religious, territorial, political, or other horizontal shifts with no change in the vertical position. The example is when a banker who works in ABC Bank moves to HBDC Bank, but with the same level of positions, and he still have the same amount of wage. Horizontal mobility can happen with volunteer or forced. Besides the two main types of social mobility can happen between generations. They are intragenerational mobility and intergenerational mobility. Intragenerational mobility. Intergenerational mobility looks at the change in circumstances during an individual's own working life. This is from Breen 2004. The intragenerational change in social position occurs during the lifespan of a single generation. It can also refer to a change in positions between siblings. For example, an individual starts their career as a clerk and through their life moves on to a senior position such as a director. One sibling may also achieve a higher position in society than their brother or their sister. The next one is intergenerational mobility. Intergenerational mobility examines the relationship between people's current circumstances and those in which they originated. This is also from Breen 2004. Intergenerational mobility happens when the social position changes from one generation to another one. The change can be upward or downward. For example, when a father worked in a factory while his son received a high education that allowed him to become a lawyer or a doctor or even having his own company. When moving from one social status to another, there must be something or some activity that we do to achieve that. There are ways to do social mobility. So, what can we do? The first one is change the living standard. Increases in income will not make any individual experience upward mobility automatically, but it will make the individual have higher living standard. So from that, it will affect the status upgrade. The second one is marriage. When someone is marrying his or her partner with higher social status, the one with lower social status can automatically experience upward mobility. He or she will have the same status as his or her partner. The third one is change of residence. To experience upward mobility, someone can move from his house to a new one or renovate the house he lives in, so it will look majestic and luxurious. And from that, society will see the person as the rich. This shows upward mobility or social climbing. The fourth one is change of behavior. To get higher social status, someone can do some habits that are usually done by the people from that higher social status. But not just habits, but also outfits, how they speak, everyday routine, and more things the people of higher social status do. And the last one is change of name. In society, name is identified to certain social positions. If doing upward mobility, it is done by changing the name to a name that are identified as higher social position or status. There are ways to finally experience social mobility, but there are also the inhibiting factors of social mobility. The inhibiting factors are racial class difference. Like what happened in South Africa, the white race reigns supreme that didn't give the same opportunity to the native black race. The second one is religion. In Hindu religion, we can find mostly in India and Bali is using the caste system in their society. The third one is class discrimination. In the closed class, that can prevent upward mobility. And the fourth one is poverty. Poverty can limit the opportunity for a person to develop and achieve a certain social status. And the last one is gender differences. Gender differences in society also affect achievement, power, and opportunities to improve their social status. Well, this usually happens to women. Women usually have lower status than men. For so long, the society thinks like that. But now, that can finally change. Because right now, women can also have the same opportunity like men did. Social mobility will definitely make an impact to the society, whether it's positive or negative. Because we can say social mobility is a structure with all kinds of people in it. So, what is the impacts of social mobility? The negative impacts are conflict between classes. The example is when laborers demand their wage to increase to the superiors. The second one is conflict between social groups. The example is ethnic conflict and conflict between natives and immigrants. The third one is intergenerational conflict. There are different cultures between youths, people, and old generations. Some of the youth culture have totally different values than the older generations, and that can lead to a misunderstanding or maybe even a conflict. And the last one is readjustment. Readjustment is actually not really a negative impact, but readjustment can only happen after conflict. When both sides of the conflict parties feels like the conflict does more harm than the positive things. The readjustment is usually called accommodations. When there's negative impacts, of course there will be positive impacts. So, what's the positive impacts of social mobility? The first one, people will race to make achievement or make a progress from what they're doing, because from that, they will have a chance to move to a higher social class. The second one is social mobility will accelerate social change in society for the better. And the example is from the first positive impacts. The example is when a poor kid study hard so he can have a higher education than his parents did. And the example from the positive impacts is happening is Indonesia. Right now, Indonesia is having changed from the agrarian society to an industrial society. So, the conclusion is social mobility is an individual person's movement from one status to another or from one level to another. There are two main types of social mobility: vertical mobility and horizontal mobility. Besides the main two types of social mobility can also happen between generations. There are several ways so that people can experience social mobility, especially upward mobility. The example is marriage. But there are also inhibiting factors of social mobility, like racial class discrimination and poverty, and even religion. And of course, there are also impacts from social mobility, whether it's positive or negative. The positive impacts, people in society will race to achieve a higher achievement. And the negative impacts, there could be a conflict happens between social groups. I think that's all about social mobility. I hope you can get more information from my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry if I made any mistake. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.